his intellectual contributions, or do you think there actually is an interplay, there's an influence there?
There is some influence. I mean, talking to members of his family, and his sister was still alive when I started working on the book, she said the family were astonished by him. You know, none of them were particularly academic. And here was this chap who was just winning all these scholarships and annihilating the opposition. And they couldn't understand where he came from at all. You know, that he didn't seem to fit into this family that were fairly hearty. They played golf and that kind of stuff, but they weren't brilliant academics. So the initial family...
And sorry, golf in St Andrews specifically.
Golf in St Andrews
so they were knocking around the old course.
Yes, that's right. It was tremendous. You know, they went on camping holidays. They were a very sort of standard middle-class family. I suppose Shrewsbury is important for two reasons. The first is clearly he decided to specialize in classics. And you can tell in his philosophy that he's a man who's used to reading things very carefully, word by word, sentence by sentence, with glosses and commentaries. He just works at... Somebody complains about it. He was... You know, when they started to read books with Austin, he very rarely got beyond the first few sentences because he thought, he actually said, all the philosophical errors are contained in the gaps in the first paragraph. Right. That's where well, that's probably true of something like Descartes' Meditations. And so that's a very classicist way of approaching it. Yeah. I think the other thing is that Shrewsbury at the time was not an attractive place to be. I mean, Austin was obviously a slightly withdrawn character anyway. He wouldn't play bridge with it. He didn't like making up bridge parties with his family because that interfered with his homework. He wanted to be in his room by himself working, would work until 2 and 3 in the morning, even as a young adolescent.
And how many were there in the family? Were there 4?
There was a father and mother, and there were 4 other children. He was the second child and the second son. And but it was a very happy household. It was very sort of outgoing and hearty and rather sort of empire-minded. And then he goes to Shrewsbury, and obviously Shrewsbury was an excellent school for classics. The classics teacher, and I give 1 or 2 examples in the book, was very dramatic and exciting. They really made an effort to make this stuff live. But the atmosphere in the boarding houses was pretty grim. You know, there was very systematic bullying. You know, I knew you were divided into those carrying out the bullying and those being bullied. And, you know, there was something like, you know, the first 15 could wear 9 combinations of tie and boater. You know, if you got this wrong, you got beaten really quite savagely. Or anybody with an accent was given a month to lose it. You were assigned a tutor who would teach you how to say "how now, brown cow" correctly. And if you still had a northern accent at the end of a month, both you and the tutor would be beaten every week until you lost it. So it was quite vicious, something. You know.
And which side was Austin on?
Well, pleasingly, he didn't want to be on either. And so that made him rather withdrawn. There's a letter written to his wife in 1940 where he says, when I was at school, I was thoroughly insociable. I despised everybody and just wanted to get on with my own work. So he basically said, Shrewsbury had no influence on me apart from making me very solitary and self-focused. So I think the classical training and this very severe bullying both had an influence on him in later life. You know, it inclined him to solitariness. Although paradoxically, he's a philosopher who worked best with other people in discussion. So there's this slight paradox in Austin's background. So I would mention those 2 things as being formative influences.
Thank you. And talk to us about his journey from classics to philosophy. How did that happen?
Well, I discovered an unpublished paper he wrote late in life in about 1959, where he said, I just drifted into it. I couldn't think of anything better to do. You know, and he just thought he wanted to stay on, and he thought, I seem to be quite good at philosophy. I mean, as he'd done greats, he'd probably only done, you know, at most 2 or 3 terms of philosophy. And he was obviously very academic, and the 1930s was a very difficult time for employment. So he thought, this seems as good as anything, you know, I'll go into it. So he didn't have a sort of tremendous urge to be a philosopher. He just found himself doing it and then gradually got sucked in. I mean, I think when he started to talk with contemporaries like Ayer and start hearing about things like logical positivism, he thought, this sounds outrageous. You know, I've got lots of criticisms of this, and I suspect that's how he got stuck into it.
So can we just get some dates on this? So he's coming up to Balliol in early 30s?
No, he comes up in 1929. And it was a 4-year course, so he stays until 33. From 33 to 35, he's at All Souls.
As a prize fellow.
As a prize fellow. And then in 35, he becomes a tutorial fellow at Magdalen. I mean, I understand the All Souls Prize Fellowship lasted for 7 years, but you were encouraged to do other things. And clearly 7 years is a long time, but a finite time. And there was terrible unemployment for our academics as well. And as this other job came up, he thought, I'd better do that, because he knew lots of his contemporaries were really struggling. Again, it wasn't, I think, because at that time, he wasn't particularly motivated as a teacher. He actually tried some teaching at All Souls and said to his mother, it's like trying to strike matches on soap. That's how he described it. That's how he described his experience of teaching.
As in the undergrads are the
yeah, they're the soap,
right.
basically. So he wasn't, and his mother thought he didn't really like teaching, and perhaps this was a bad move.
And so he's finished Greats in 33 as an undergraduate. In the prize fellowship, he's beginning to explore some philosophical questions.
Yes, he is. And I mean, what he did at All Souls was he started working very hard on sort of classical texts. He clearly read immensely widely in Aristotle. I mean, all the most obscure works as well as the most important ones. He read widely in Plato, on which he was slated to lecture, but unfortunately the war intervened. He worked at Kant to a certain extent. He worked on the Tractatus. And he began to have these classes with people like Isaiah Berlin and Ayer talking about contemporary philosophy. This would have been really his first introduction to sort of cutting edge logic of the kind found in the Tractatus and logical positivists and that kind of stuff. I mean, his teaching at Balliol appears to have been very old-fashioned. Balliol was rather backward I mean, it had good philosophers, but they were rather backward looking by the standards of the early 30s. There was a great deal of British idealism. There's a man.
So can we just talk about what are the intellectual currents that are swirling at the time? So idealism, and you mentioned Ayer as well.
Well, when he first went to Balliol, it was still very idealistic. You were studying people like F.H. Bradley and people of that sort. And he was taught by a man called C.G. Stone, who was actually his tutor for Roman history, but has written an extraordinary book called The Social Contract of the Universe. I got a copy out of the London Library, and I was the third person to take it out since 1933. You know? so it wasn't a smash hit. And I duly read it, and I think I describe it in the book, it's like being trapped inside the world's most abstract and least interesting fairy tale. You know? It had publishers' adverts up the back, and you kept thinking, I wish I was reading that book, like, you know, sort of like German diplomatic documents, 4 volumes, or, you know, there was one called Livestock in Barracks. I thought that sounded quite fun. I thought, anyway, I did sit down and read this book, which is virtually incomprehensible, I have to say. And it basically said, you know, it starts off from the fact that there's something rather than nothing. This is your premise. And you end up and what you end up with is we all become eternal monads who love one another forever. And then this is proved from there is something rather than nothing. So you're trying to follow this reasoning.
And so in some sense, it's committed to the possibility of metaphysics.
Oh, absolutely. And the afterlife and immortality. And the whole world, as we understand, the whole world generated by common sense and science is an illusion. It's superficial to believe that this should carry any weight with us at all. You know, there's a higher reality beyond it, basically. So he has that.
And that's the older generation.
That's very much the older generation. It was taught in Balliol because Balliol had always been because Benjamin Jowett had been the master in the sort of 1860s, I suppose, and he was the person who really introduced Hegel and the study of Hegel into British universities. And he always made sure that he appointed an idealist tutor, and they appointed other idealists. So it hung on for a long time at Balliol. But there were these other characters around who were called the Oxford Realists. And they're people like H.A. Pritchard and Joseph. And Cook Wilson actually died in 1915, but he's the origin of Oxford Realism. And both Joseph and Pritchard, I think, were his pupils. And they basically took the opposite view. They believed in you know, the language of science. They believed that common sense reality was pretty much how it is. They thought all this idealist stuff was just generated by linguistic misunderstandings. So they were sort of much more hard-nosed critical characters, but rather practical bent. I think Cook Wilson spent his holidays, interestingly, writing about the use of bicycles in military strategy. That was another problem, and working on very detailed classical commentary. And I think Austin came across these people in lectures. He went to their lectures and I think was pretty deeply impressed by them. And I think for a while he was an Oxford realist. Then he goes to Magdalen and he arranges a class with Isaiah Berlin on Mind and the World Order by C.I. Lewis. And this is an American pragmatist text. And interestingly, this appears to be the first seminar it was one of the first seminars in Oxford. They didn't really do seminars, so it was a class, and that was new. And also, it was the first class on a contemporary text. No philosophical text had ever had a class on it. They were always looking at the classics or Hume or whatever. And this clearly had a big impact both on him and the other people in the group. And then at the beginning of 1937, they form a discussion group about logical positivism, basically, with Ayer kind of leading the logical positivist charge. And who else attended? Well, Austin, obviously. People like Hampshire. There was a man called McLagan. There's another man, what's his name? There were several sort of future civil servants. And there are about 6 of them altogether. And they had this discussion group, basically, looking at logical positivism, and eventually, I think Ayer had just published Language, Truth, and Logic. And logical positivism, just for anybody who doesn't know, is basically it's interesting. It starts off with knowledge, and it says there are basically 2 kinds of knowledge. There's knowledge which is based on empirical observation and the senses, and there's basically tautologies, truths of definition. That's it. So things like any claim that, for example, theology could produce knowledge was just ridiculous. In fact, what theology said wasn't false. It was actually meaningless. It appeared to have a meaning, but didn't have it at all. And even things like, but they had to find some role for art and ethics. And so they therefore said things like, well, when I say that was a bad thing, murder is bad, I'm basically saying murder, boo. I'm just expressing my emotions. Or Leonardo is a great artist can be translated as Leonardo, hooray. Something of that sort. It's the emotive theory of ethics. It's very thin. And I think Austin was fairly outraged by that. He thought that was altogether too simple. That was far too simple. And he led the charge against logical positivism, largely using the kind of arguments the Oxford realists had used against the idealists, saying it's based on misunderstanding of language. If you actually look how we use these words like illusion and reality, you'll find they're not used as the logical positivists say they used, for example. So it was these 2, basically, the class on C.I. Lewis, followed a year later by this discussion group in All Souls with Ayer, Berlin, Austin, and several other people. That basically began to form him as an original philosophical thinker.
Okay, good. So we've got 3, as it were, schools of thought which are contesting the intellectual space at the time. The idealists, and obviously coming out of the Vienna Circle, logical positivism, which Ayer is the representative of, and the Oxford realists. But then shared with both of those criticisms of the idealists is this suspicion about the abuse of language, this question about the status of language.
Yes, it has to be said that idealism was pretty vestigial by the early 30s. It existed a bit of Bailey, but not in many very other people. And the idealists tend to be older men than the Oxford realists, so most of them had retired or died by the time Austin got to university. So it's basically, I think he started off as his mature position was he started off as an Oxford realist, criticizing logical positivism, using rather similar arguments that the Oxford realists had used against the idealists. I mean, actually phenomenalism, because the logical positivists tended to be phenomenalists, meaning that basically the world is, matter is the permanent possibility of sensation. They analyze, there is a table unseen next door, as if I were to go next door, I would see a table. You analyze in terms of unseen things and analyze in terms of conditionals. And that is a kind of idealism, actually. And Austin was very critical of that for you.
Okay. Let's move on to the war, if we may.
Sure.
Where is he at the start of the war? What happens in the course of
well, he starts off, let me just think. He starts thinking he ought to be joining, because as an Oxford Don, it was actually a reserved occupation. You didn't have to join up initially. And initially, he just joins what became the Home Guard, which was known as, in those days as the LDV, which was the local defence volunteers. Although some wag had said this actually stood, LDV actually stood for look, duck, and vanish. Because, because basically, when the German panzers start rolling towards you, you've got a shotgun and a petrol bomb, you know, you're going to clear off. Actually, Churchill was very upset by this title and said that LDV is hopeless, local defence volunteers. You know, we want something much more martial. And he came up with the name Home Guard, which is the one that stuck. Anyway, he joined a local Oxford unit, which was the most erudite unit, which consists of Lord Longford, Thomas Pakenham was in it, C.S. Lewis, A.J.P. Taylor, you know, I mean, lots of very distinguished. And they had, very unusually, but the army had left an enormous amount of its equipment behind at Dunkirk. So the local defence volunteers couldn't really be equipped with guns. Very unusually, the Oxford group did have guns, but they didn't have any ammunition. So they would patrol with these guns without ammunition, sort of, you know, people happily wandering through the university parks at night would be turned back, you know, and they'd be asked to account for their position and stuff. Eventually, they did get a clip of ammunition. They got 5 rounds, and there was a veteran there who'd been in the Boer War and the First World War, and he was given the 5 rounds because he was thought to be the most experienced.
So 5 rounds collectively, not
5 rounds collectively.
Okay,
He
right,
had 5 rounds, and he put them in his rifle and decided to demonstrate. And actually, the thing went off unexpectedly, and it virtually blew off Lord Longford's foot. He was in, and Austin was peppered on the backside, so it nearly brought about complete disaster. Austin wasn't badly injured, but Thomas Pakenham was. It was basically the end of his military career, and I think he was in bed for 10 weeks, you know, as they reattached his foot. So his LDV experience was quite frightening. He did think, though, I'd better start doing something serious. He joined up the middle of 1940. And he was sent off for training at Aldershot, just doing standard squaddy stuff, doing, you know, parading and learning how to clean his rifle and learning the names of all the bits and pieces. But they fairly quickly got the idea this is somebody pretty clever. And this is the very moment, in fact, the very weeks when the intelligence corps was being formed, because they realized our intelligence before Dunkirk was completely hopeless. We had no idea what the Germans were doing. We need a corps, you know, a group of people that really know about intelligence. So they formed the intelligence corps, and Austin was one of its very first members. And he was sent off to, I think he was sent off to Winchester to pick up his kit. And then he was sent off to Matlock to do an intelligence officer's course. And for, I don't know, about 10 or 12 weeks towards the end of 1940, he was a very intensive course in German language, for example, and French, and map reading, and they watched Nazi propaganda films and learned the rudiments of, you know, radio intelligence and map reading and all that kind of stuff. So he did a very intensive course at this big hydro in Matlock, which finished right at the end of 1940. And then, shall I carry on?
Absolutely.
Then he goes home to his future wife's house, actually, and proposes to her. So he proposes to Jean Coots, as she was. And then about a week later, they learned he's to go up to London to learn what's going to happen to him. And clearly they're very worried that, having just proposed, he's going to be sent abroad, or, you know, he could easily be sent somewhere very dangerous and be killed. But in fact, he receives a notice to say that his report to GHQ Home Forces, which was basically the headquarters of the defensive army defending against the German invasion. And for about a week, he works in what's now the cabinet war rooms, you know, the underground bunker. And he works for a group called the Advanced Intelligence Section, which is basically 4 or 5 people. And they're looking at things like the invasion barges which the Germans are gathering in French ports, or where Stuka squadrons are going to be stationed, that kind of stuff. But he only does that for about a week or 2. And then he's seconded to MI14. I mean, we've all heard of MI5 and MI6. MI5 is the security service, looking for foreign spies in our own country. MI6 is the secret intelligence service, which basically runs agents abroad. But in the Second World War, it went from MI1 to MI19. And the really important ones were MI3, which advised the Chief of the General Staff on the state of the opposing armies. And eventually the unit that was looking at the German army became so important, it became a separate MI in its own right. It became MI14. And Austin is sent to join MI14. when basically he starts to work on North Africa and the North African campaign.
And so he develops a deep expertise on Rommel is running around at the time in North Africa.
Yes.
And then he's, if I remember rightly, he's then involved in the intelligence picture for Dieppe, which is one of the key raids.
He is. Perhaps I would say something a bit, I ought to say a little bit about North Africa, because I think this is where he establishes his reputation.
Yeah.
That what happens is he joins at the beginning of 1941. The British had been, I mean, the performance of the British Army at the beginning of the Second World War, it's something you don't learn at school, was absolutely terrible. You know, it consisted of, you know, we head off to Norway and we have a forced evacuation and a seaborne, evacuation. We then try France and the Low Countries, and it ends in a retreat and a forced evacuation by sea. We then have Greece, and that ends in a forced defeat and evacuation by sea. And then there's Crete, and the same thing happens. So and then there's Singapore falls. So it's terrible, apart from North Africa, where basically the British were fighting the Italians, who were there having invaded Abyssinia and that kind of stuff. The British had about 100,000 troops. The Italians had 250,000. And Mussolini, seeing that we were in terrible trouble and about to be invaded by Hitler, decided this would be a splendid moment to try and grab the Suez Canal and large chunks of Egypt and the oil industry and so forth. So Mussolini attacked the British, and the British campaign against him was absolutely extraordinarily successful. You know, in about a number of weeks, the smaller British force entirely annihilated the huge Italian force. You know, extraordinary. I mean, when they asked General O'Connor, how many prisoners have you got, just after the Battle of Baie de Fomme, which is February 1941, he said, prisoners, we've got 2 acres of officers and 53 acres of other ranks. Well, that's a lot of prisoners. You know, it was extraordinarily successful. And this was the only thing, as regards the army's performance, that the British could really be proud of. And Churchill and General Staff were obviously very proud of the way the army had performed there. And what Austin discovered was, Austin, he was just the new boy. He was reading foreign magazines. He was reading minutes of meetings. He was doing what was called reading his way into the war. He was bored. He'd had flu. He'd done very badly in an exercise, but he was just reading stuff that other people weren't reading. And he said, some of these pictures of shipping in the Bay of Naples, there seem to be a lot of heavy German transports here. A lot of troop movements down through Italy. What on earth's going on? And I think I kind of worked out by looking at Austin's letters and the dates available for when, the General Staff received certain minutes, that Austin was the person who detected that the Germans were going to move into North Africa to basically support their defeated allies. They didn't want the British to win in North Africa. And so they decided to send Rommel and the Africa Corps. And I think Austin was the man who said, look, this is happening, this is important. And people said, no way, he's not interested in that. He's interested in Russia or invading Britain. And Austin obviously stuck to his guns. And suddenly there were then some Enigma decrypts and stuff. And suddenly they realized, my God, this very mechanized German force is heading for North Africa. And that was seriously important. I mean, not only because there's a 2 or 3 year campaign that was very hard fought and very bloody. I mean, one has to remember that in North Africa, there were probably 5 or 6 divisions at most on both sides, whereas in Hitler's attack on Russia, you're talking about something like 185 or 200 German divisions. So it's vastly bigger, but it was a very bloody campaign. And it's not only important because of that campaign, but also because something I only discovered fairly recently, that is Rommel's force was wholly mechanized. It was all tanks, it was all trucks, it was all motorbikes, it was all half trucks. That's very, very unusual for the German army. The German army in France and the German army in Russia was very reliant on horse transport, still. And at D-Day, still, it was very reliant on horses. And taking so many troops, so many mechanized forces to North Africa, drew off a lot of German armor and trucks to the North African campaign, leaving them weakened in France on the Eastern Front. So anyway, I think Austin establishes himself as a brilliant intelligence officer, because basically he's the trainee. He's been there 5 weeks and said, look, there's this serious strategic movement, and they said, get away. And then it turns out to be true. And suddenly he's in charge of order of battle in North Africa. So he's the man who has to say, how many tanks Rommel is going to have next time he attacks, where these tanks are, what are his forces, how well trained are they. He did that, and a guy called Noel Annan, later Provost of Kings, he did the shipping. So Annan said what ships are going across, and Austin said basically what the ships are carrying. And between them, they were the intelligence officers for the North African campaign, where the intelligence was very, very good. You know, it was startlingly good.
And so the work of an intelligence officer is to fuse information coming in from multiple sources,
Yes.
and then provide an interpretation, effectively, a kind of prediction of various potential future courses of action for the enemy. And the sources that are coming in at the moment, imagery is coming in, human intelligence sources, signals intelligence, crucially via Bletchley at that point, and then open source intelligence.
Yes, prisoners of war were clearly quite important. Also, deserters, people who sort of worked on fortifications and then deserted, Polish officers and stuff.
And how is there something distinctive about the way Austin fuses all this information in the way he works?
Yes, I mean, I ought to say that having done so well in North Africa, it's then decided that, you know, everybody realized at some point we've got to re-invade the continent. We're certainly not in a position to do it yet. I mean, it surprised everybody that the Second World War was such an amphibious war. I mean, basically they expected a war just like the First World War, which was static. And I know that Britain had one landing craft in 1930. That was all they had. I mean, why would you, why would the Second World War be amphibious, you know? And they had no information about invading the France, because they said, well, why would we want to invade France? France is our most important ally. You know, there's no point in France for us. And anyway, so they had a very poor, so they realized they were going to have to reinvade the continent. And they needed somebody good to be in charge of the intelligence for 30 miles inland, all the way down the French coast, in fact, from the north of Holland right down to the Spanish frontier. And what happens is Austin is taken off North African intelligence, having done very well, and he's put in charge of what was effectively the advanced intelligence unit he'd first joined at the beginning of 1941. These 4 or 5 people looking at the French coast. But when he's put back in charge, they're no longer thinking of it defensively, i.e. how is Hitler going to invade us? They're thinking about how are we going to invade him? It's just a new inflection. And Austin takes this group over, and it hadn't been working very well. Everyone was rather demoralized. They really realized we're in no position to invade anybody. It won't be for years. And then suddenly you get Pearl Harbor, and the Americans become involved. And you've got this massive industrial force behind you, this incredible capacity for building ships and landing craft and tanks. And they suddenly think, oh, it might be possible. You know, this is not just a whim. It might be possible within, 2 or 3 years, something like that. So Austin's put in charge of this, and it's revivified by this knowledge of America's now in the war. Unfortunately, Hitler, for no particular reason, declared war against America. Because it might easily have happened that the Americans thought, well, we're fighting the Japanese. Why do we want to fight in Europe? Let's beat the Japanese first. But they didn't, partly because Hitler declared war, which he shouldn't have done. And Austin is put in charge of this unit again, and it starts to work very efficiently. This is partly because they built up on the Caen area, they built up a network of just ordinary people. They weren't really agents. They were just hundreds of ordinary people just noting down things that the Germans were doing and passing them to 1 or 2 important people who then sent it to England. And as you say, collating signals intelligence and deserters and prisoners of war and all this kind of stuff. And gradually, Austin began to run this unit. And how he did it was, he made each member of the unit a specialist. So I interviewed 2 members of the unit who were still alive in 2012. One was Derek Ezra, later chairman of the Coal Board. He was at war with Arthur Scargill in the 80s, you might remember, and he was in charge of railway intelligence and in railway movements and what's passing what stations on. And the other one was a woman called Philippa Dawson, and she was in charge of lorry parks and Ukrainian regiments. Odd combination, I don't know. But anyway, she had these 2. And basically what happened was the intelligence would come in, Austin would read it, he would pass it out to the specialist, they had to work out all the implications of this, and then they would feed back into Austin. This group, Austin called the Martians. It's not quite clear why he called them the Martians. It's possibly because, well, it's H.G. Wells. It could because the Martians invaded us, so, they're the alien force attacking us. It's probably more likely, though, that the Germans are the Martians and we want to counterattack against them. And this group, the Martians, began to produce something called the Martian Reports, which is a kind of 20, 30-page document listing all the new intelligence that's come in under certain subheadings. And with a number of appendices, doing things like, some new German generals appeared on the scene, so we have a profile of that German general. Or some new gun has appeared, the PAC-8, the 88mm gun has appeared. We need a profile of that gun and what it can do. So with some quite important appendices at the back. And these began to appear once a week. An Austin section produced it. And what's important about Austin section is not only what they were doing, and they began to specialize in man-made defenses, like, anti-tank ditches, anti-tank guns, minefields, that kind of stuff. But because they had this newsletter as well, and they began to collate information from other sections. There's a group called ISTD, for example, which did the physical geography. What the beach is made of. We need to know what the beach is made of when we land on it. And Austin began to put information about that in, and also stuff coming from prisoners of war. He'd put that in. So the Martians and the Martian Reports not only did their own stuff, they also became the kind of nerve center, the collation center, the dissemination center for everything to do with the first phase of D-Day, the naval operations, and up to 30 miles inland. And under Austin, it began to really go some, because he was a very inspiring leader. He was incredibly meticulous. He was reading more than 2,000 agents' reports a week. I mean, tens of thousands of aerial photographs were coming in, all of which, and he was handing these things out unbelievably. It was a very good atmosphere in the unit. Apparently, nobody called him Sir, everybody called him Austin, and then other sort of first name terms. And it soon became the center for a naval component had already joined. And so it's very unusual. This was not only is it the nerve center for D-Day, but it's the first joint intelligence unit. It's partly Navy, it's partly Army. There is an RAF unit, which only lasts a very short time. I don't know why the RAF left, but they did. But they realized that the Navy and the Army realized they need to work together.
And the quality of the intelligence, there's a story you tell which gives an indication of the impact of his work. So shortly after D-Day, I believe it was an American unit was assaulting a German strong point.
Yes.
And they tried, they failed initially. They knew it was just a matter of time before they'd have the reinforcements to create the force asymmetry that would result in this. And they thought, but this is inevitable. They don't have to die, we don't have to die. So 2 jeeps waving white flags drive up to the German strong point. They're ushered in, they have a meeting with the German commander. And the American commander explains the situation. The German commander's unperturbed by this, willing to fight on. And at which point the intelligence officer who's accompanying him gets out the map, shows them the fields of fire for all the individual strong points at this large fortification figure, shows the weapon stocks, the amount of ammunition that's held at each strong point, and then identifies that Lieutenant, I can't remember his name, is missing because he fell ill with flu 2 weeks ago. and at that point, the German commander says, actually, okay, I think we'll surrender.
Yes, because it's very discouraging to see that they know your gun, they know which gun isn't working, they know the precise ammunition, they know the names of everybody.
And the dissemination is also really striking, if I may. So, as a philosopher, it's how to do things with words and so forth that I've read. It may be that Austin's most read publication was something different. So there was a genre, I mean, this is all from Mark, but there's a genre of book that precedes in the 1920s to 30s, which is called Vade Mecums, Come With Me. So it might be your Vade Mecum for fishing or for playing polo or something like this. It's a sort of guide to how to do this. And Austin, with real classicist wit, produces a booklet which was accompanied by every D-Day officer who went ashore, which is called Invade Mecum. Come invade with me. So I sort of imagine a small proportion of classically trained officers going ashore on the beaches of D-Day. But what it indicates is this real commitment from the teamwork that he's fused to then distribute this intelligence. I'm just aware of time. Can we go to post-war? His post-war, in a way, his heyday, philosophical heyday here in Oxford. Let's just talk about that and then his legacy, and then we'll open for questions. Right. So why not talk us through what's the process by which what does he learn from the war that he brings to Oxford? How does that impact his way of doing philosophy? What are his intellectual priorities at that time?
Right, I think as regards how to do philosophy, and there's a rather interesting letter he writes to his wife in 1940. He says, I'm slightly unnerved by what I'm doing at the minute, because when I was doing philosophy before the war, I was dealing with imponderables. You know, I was coming up with these answers. Nobody particularly cared what the answers were. It didn't really affect anybody. You know, it was a sort of niche pursuit. And suddenly I'm asked, how many tanks are there in this depot? And it's absolutely vital I get it right. Somebody's going to find out whether I'm right or wrong, and thousands of men's lives could depend on this. So he said, this is a completely new experience for him. Initially, he's a little bit unnerved by it, but soon gets in the swing of it. And as I've described roughly how he ran his intelligence unit. And I think he thought, well, if this is the way you solve intelligence problems, why don't we approach philosophical problems in exactly the same way? Why don't we just assume, you know, there is a correct answer? And why don't we do it basically by committee? You know, I will set the problem. We will have a group. I will divide them into specialists. They will go off and do their studies. They'll feed back into the group. We'll write a report. In fact, I didn't realize somebody sent me an unpublished paper by Geoffrey Warnock, which he gave in the 60s, where he makes clear that, in a way that isn't clear in any published source, how radical Austin's proposals were. I mean, Austin thought perhaps you ought to publish philosophical papers like scientific papers with 12 names attached, or perhaps no names. Why not get all the criticisms in first before it's published and then publish it? So it's kind of bulletproof, you know. So I think that's what he was trying to do in 1947 when he set up his Saturday morning group. Let's take a philosophical problem and let's approach it like intelligence officers. And let's not sit around in armchairs, you know, and sort of, you know, smoke pipes and stuff. Let's, you know, assume there's a correct answer. Let's do it like an intelligence team, or even a high-powered business board. You know, let's do it. These are solvable problems. Let's solve them. So that's something he gets out of them. I think also personally, before the war, if you look at his notes and his personality, his notes are absolutely full and meticulous, and there are no jokes, and there are no crossings out. And he was clearly a rather withdrawn, intimidating person. I think in the war, he realized he couldn't be that meticulous. He had to run lots of meetings. He was just writing notes. And he actually realized he was good at bringing out other people's personalities and using their expertise. And in that way, he becomes a much more sort of social sort of a character, using other people to help him work, sounding ideas off them. So not only did he bring this new attitude to solving philosophical problems, it also affected him. It made him a slightly different person, because, you know, if you look at his notes after the war, they're incredibly scrappy and crossed out, and because they're just intended to start a discussion. They're not intended to end it and be the sort of, you know, the answer. And they're full of jokes, because he obviously realized that people thought he was funny, you know, and apparently, you know, he knew he was good at people making laugh, and then he would apparently disapproved, and that made it even funnier somehow. Don't you dare laugh. And of course, people had to suppress it, and then they laughed more. So it did affect his personality. He became used to dealing with committees, dealing with senior officers, and that kind of stuff. So it brought him out of himself personally as well, I think.
There's one point in the book where you describe Oxford philosophy as, quote, a stew of competitiveness and anxiety.
Yes.
And but you think he changed on that?
Yeah. I think in some ways he was. I wouldn't say. I think he did have some kind of anxiety. He hated to be shown to be wrong in public, for example. He really couldn't bear, or admitting he had been wrong in the past. It was something he found very difficult. I think you have to realize that Oxford after the war, it was a huge department by contemporary standards, and it was also the focal point of world philosophy. You know, much more so than in America. You know, this is where the exciting philosophy is going on in the 1950s. And that brings its pressures. You know, people were expected to do interesting and spectacular things, and if you weren't, you could feel very pressured. And I quote two sources in the book. One is John Lucas, who some of you may still remember, who said as a young man he would drive back into Oxford after the holidays, and as he turned into Oxford, he would feel sick with anxiety. He thought of people making sneery remarks about him and undermining him and saying he's good to his face, but then running him down behind his back. And he said it was absolutely awful. He said, I had to really get a grip on myself. And the other one is a man who taught at Lincoln College, Cox, who was actually Gene Coots's tutor. And he was apparently a very vicious wit, and people were quite frightened of him. But if he had to give a seminar, he'd be trying to call it off all morning, and everything he wrote, he destroyed. And eventually he wrote a book on Kant, but burnt that, and then got cancer and committed suicide, as he said he always would. So that doesn't sound like a sort of a happy man, you know. So underneath this rather tweedy surface, it was quite competitive, and you know, because it was the centre of the world. You know, I said to Mary Warnock, you know, Austin got lots of offers from, you know, universities in the States, and she said, well, we all did, all the time. You know, they were always asking us because we were where it was at, and that did bring its pressures.
Yeah, great. So there's so much I could carry on talking about, but I really want to make time for an open conversation. So let me just throw it open. Who would like to follow up with comments, questions, talk about areas of Austin's life that we haven't covered? So David, maybe. Yeah.
What it was in Oxford is so attractive to people outside. What was thought to be new and interesting that was being done here?
Yes, I'm sure. Yes, we did miss that out. Basically, I suppose ordinary language philosophy. Now, I maintain contentiously that this was basically begun by. There are antecedents in the Oxford realists, but it was the modern version of ordinary language philosophy, I think, began to burgeon when Wittgenstein returned to Cambridge in 1929 and began to talk to disciples and began to dictate the Blue Book and Brown Book in about 1933-35. And these began to circulate in Oxford, according to Isaiah Berlin, from about mid-1937 onwards. And I think quite a few people, including Austin, read the Blue Book and the Brown Book, and certainly the Blue Book has a fairly obvious imprint on his work. And the basic idea is the logical positivists maintain that philosophical problems are largely pseudo-problems. They look like profound problems, but you only look deep because they're actually incomprehensible. I mean, Wittgenstein gives the example of what time is it on the sun? You think, yes, that is a hard question. What time is it on the sun? How would you work that out? And then you actually realize, well, that's a nonsensical question. And Wittgenstein clearly thought that philosophical questions, although apparently making sense, didn't, although they were much harder to diagnose than what time is it on the sun. So the thought in ordinary language philosophy is philosophical problems are pseudo problems, and what you have to do is once you look at you compare how philosophers use language with how the same terms are used in ordinary life. You then realize that the philosophers aren't using them in the same way, and it's actually this special way philosophers have of using ordinary words that generate philosophical problems. What you need to do is not try and answer philosophical questions, but the thought was philosophical problems aren't solved, they're dissolved. So rather than trying to answer the question, you dissolve the question. So things like free will and perception and so forth, what you need to do is analyze the language of free will, analyze the language of perception, and then these apparently profound philosophical questions like, you know, is the world really colored, or is colored something produced by our own sense organs, brains and sense organs, that will disappear. And clearly that was pursued most wholeheartedly in Oxford from about 1946 until 1959-60. And that was why there was so much attention on it. This was really a new way of doing philosophy, and it was found pretty exciting. And the eyes of the world were on us, because in America, there'd been pragmatists, there still were some pragmatists, lots of the logical positivists had gone to America, but it's basically still science-based. Quine, for example, and Goodman, they became probably the most important post-war American philosophers, but they're basically interested in the same kind of, answering the same kind of problems in the same kind of way as the positivists. Whereas the Oxford ordinary language stuff was thought to be new and significant and exciting. And that's why the eyes of the world were on it. Yes. Yes. Relations were problematic. I mean, it has to be said that their styles were completely different. Now, that's the first thing. That Wittgenstein, after the war, had a number of disciples in Oxford, notably Elizabeth Anscombe and Peter Geach and a number of other people. And the Oxford view, well, this was an absurdly romantic way of doing philosophy. It was theatrical, it was attitudinizing, all this stuttering and backtracking and holding of the forehead and saying how difficult philosophy was. That didn't fit in with Austin's view of what philosophy should be like at all. But if you're thinking of it like an intelligence officer or a civil servant, it was far too individualistic. Wittgenstein actually said Austin actually said at one point when he just finished reading the Investigations, Wittgenstein had entirely the wrong conception of what a philosopher was. He still thought of him as a kind of seer. Well, the first thing is their styles are completely incompatible. There's a wonderful letter a very rude letter by Isaiah Berlin about the Wittgensteinians, saying, oh, it's full of, head holding and perverted Catholicism and other delightful components, or words to that effect. So that their styles were completely antithetical. There are also some differences, clearly, in the method of linguistic philosophy. I mean, Austin is interested in very precise distinctions between near synonyms, which clearly Wittgenstein wasn't interested in. He's interested in knowledge or belief or emotion, and it kind of survives in translation in a way that Austin doesn't. And there are other things too, like Wittgenstein is deeply interested in error. He wants to know how you got into this false opinion. What root was it? How can we trace it? And you need to understand the roots, and then you can kind of see what you've been doing. And it's almost like a psychoanalyst and somebody being analyzed together, that you can then unravel it, and then you'll no longer want to say what you said earlier. So he's very interested in error. Austin wasn't. Austin just thought, you've made a mistake, correct it. This is, the correct way to, the correct method for correcting your problems is this, do it. So he's never interested in error. And Wittgenstein, he's interested in natural responses. How does language arise from, cries of pain? He's very interested in children and teaching children, how children learn language, in a way that Austin isn't. Austin occasionally mentions children, but it's largely in a disciplinary rather than pedagogical context. So there are distinctions in the ways they do it. And finally, I actually think that probably Austin got more from the later Wittgenstein than Austin was prepared to admit. Austin never says, I wasn't influenced by Wittgenstein. It's his pupils like John Searle and Warnock who say, ridiculous to suppose he was influenced. Whereas I think, if you look at Austin's paper, The Meaning of a Word, there are lots of very direct textual echoes of the Blue Book in that. I mentioned 6 in the book. The article I based my stuff on mentions 10 or a dozen. It's quite clear that Austin read the Blue Book when he wrote that unpublished paper. And although Austin, and Austin, I say, never denied it, but he did just make disparaging comments. He said, oh, Wittgenstein, he's just another Austrian philosopher, boring, kind of thing, or poor Witters, you refer to him, has got completely the wrong idea, Ho Wang was giving some lectures on Wittgenstein, which Austin said were a great deal more helpful than Wittgenstein himself. So he did everything he could to sort of diss it. But I think that's largely anxiety of influence. He knew, and actually Anscombe went round saying, Austin's got all his best ideas from Wittgenstein. The speech act stuff, basically Wittgenstein. The language of perception stuff, anti-sensator stuff, basically Wittgenstein. So somebody was going around saying this. And Austin was very keen to deny it. I think it's fairly clear that he was influenced, though clearly he did things with slogans like meaning as use and looked at it in much greater academic detail than Wittgenstein did, even though the basic idea does come from Wittgenstein. So that partly explains why there was tension between them. Different styles, different method of linguistic philosophy, and finally, Austin's anxiety of influence. He didn't like to say he was dependent on Wittgenstein.
And actually, the language is quite fruity from Anscombe on Austin. So, quote, to think that Wittgenstein fathered that bastard. Okay. So, and that might actually be quite precise in this context.
Yes, but she
about a kind of unacknowledged paternity.
Yeah, she did. She thought he was a bastard because, yes, he got his ideas from Wittgenstein, but wasn't prepared to acknowledge them. And that's why she used the word bastard. Yes.
We'll come back there.
Yes, Stephen, and then we'll come to you. I've not had the chance to read your book yet. It sounds fantastic. I'm really interested, just picking up on that point about error. Were there any examples you found of Austin getting something wrong by way of his military intelligence assessments? I wonder if he did, how did he respond and cope with it and move forward?
Yes, I go through in some detail. We didn't really talk about data intelligence much, but I go through in some detail. 99% of it was right. But there were a number of errors. I think I mentioned about 3. which shows how catastrophic even quite small errors can be. You know, there were certain, there's a famous raid on the Melville battery at the beginning of D-Day, which was a sort of glider troop, parachute land. They landed troops by gliders because they thought the guns were extremely formidable. They thought they were 155mm howitzers, and they actually turned out to be pre-war Czech howitzers of 75mm that wouldn't have been worth such a dangerous raid in which I think 66 men were killed. There were the guns at the Pont du Hoc, which had a very famous raid by the American Rangers, who actually climbed the cliffs using grappling irons and firemen's ladders, an incredibly heroic attack on these 6 guns at the Pont du Hoc. And when they got there, they discovered that the guns had actually been moved and they'd been replaced by telegraph poles disguised as guns. They wouldn't have had that raid had they known. And actually, it did work out because the guns, the ones that hadn't been damaged in the previous bombing, were actually further back, and the Americans did destroy them. But the intelligence just wasn't quite right. There was a 75mm gun on Gold Beach that they didn't realize. Intelligence didn't tend to realize that they thought that guns on beaches would tend to sink ships. They didn't realize they would tend to enfilading fire up and down the beach to kill troops. And they got the angle of the embrasure wrong. And that caused real problems on Gold Beach. But the most significant intelligence failure was at Omaha Beach. Now, there's been an enormous amount of literature about what went wrong at Omaha, and there are all sorts of things like, you know, the swimming tanks, the amphibious tanks sunk because they were launched too far out and the weather was too rough. Perfectly true, but they later landed many wading tanks perfectly successfully. So what was it that, or the pre-D-Day bombing early in the morning went wrong because the pilots were terrified of killing their own troops, so they dropped their bombs too far inland. So the gun positions were all missed. You know, they exploded a few minefields further inland, which was helpful, but the guns were missed. But neither of those explanations really work. What actually went wrong on Omaha Beach was they thought it was a couple of second-rate battalions of a rather second-rate static division, which had been there a month or two before. And they knew what the artillery was, and they thought they're not that impressive. You know, they're not, you know, some of those German regiments defending the coast, you know, there were battalions of men who'd had stomach wounds, for example, you know, who weren't fully able, but they could still fire a machine gun, or they were very old men, or very young, or untrained, or whatever. So they thought this wasn't going to be very impressive. And what actually happened was they discovered it was the 352 division, and I think it was the 916 regiment, which was a kind of crack Panzer Grenadier. They were absolutely crack German troops. And they had attached artillery from 2 artillery battalions. So they had hugely more 105mm guns, 155mm howitzers than they expected. They had far more machine guns, very expertly positioned, so you couldn't see where the muzzle flashes were from the sea. And these were M34s and MG42s that were capable of firing 1,200 rounds a minute. You know, absolutely. So you didn't actually hear the individual. You just had the famous Hitler zip, because they were so fast firing you couldn't hear the bullets. So these things are pumping out, you know, 20 bullets a second. You know, deadly, absolutely deadly. And the reason they didn't realize this had happened was that the Germans knew that lots of the information was being sent back via pigeon. And they made owning a pigeon on the coast a capital offense. And they actually trained their own pigeons. They trained pigeons to look like Allied birds. There were all sorts of deception operations and so forth with the pigeons. But it was Rommel who actually sussed, what we need is shotgun patrols on the beaches. So he got patrols on the beaches in the early morning, guys with shotguns. You see a pigeon or a bird flying overhead, you shoot it. And we know there were 4 messages sent by the French resistance saying, it's not this rather crappy division you were expecting, it's the 352 and the crack Panzer Grenadier Regiment, the 916 on the beach. But those pigeons didn't get through. And Austin knew he was waiting for pigeons that didn't come, and they couldn't work out what had gone wrong. And what had gone wrong was it was Rommel's shotgun patrols basically got these birds. And that's why they didn't know what they were expecting on Omaha Beach, and that's why it was such a slaughter. That they had vastly more guns and artillery, and they were very experienced soldiers, many of whom had active combat experience on the Eastern Front. And that's why Omaha was such a slaughter, whereas the other beaches, in comparison, were a bit of a doddle, you know.
Great. So I've got a question over here, and then I've got a couple from people online, which I'll feed them up. Yes.
I'm interested, so Austin's in his organisation of military intelligence,
Yes.
but the sort of responsibility for D-Day, sort of what could become D-Day changes, and you get Mountbatten and Montgomery coming in and out and so on.
Yes.
Does that affect what Austin's doing?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Yes, it does. Austin was a man who liked to build up his own unit, and very often it didn't fit into an established structure. I mean, this happened in Oxford after the war, that Austin didn't decide to become influential through doing tutorials and lectures. He founded his own group and built up a power base of young lecturers and young college fellows. And people like Ryle, who basically worked through the established mechanisms, many of which Ryle had actually set up, the B-Phil and so forth, was upset about this. That was one reason for the tension between those two philosophers. So Austin, and he got a taste for this clearly during the war. That initially the advanced intelligence section was originally under GHQ Home Forces, which became the 21st Army Group, which was the bit that invaded France. That was a British unit. Churchill, meeting Roosevelt in Casablanca, realized this really ought to be both nations, or a number of nations, need to be involved in this. It shouldn't just be a British operation or the British in charge. So they set up a new organization called Cossack, which is commanding officer of the, I can't remember exactly what it stands for, but it's designed to be the unit that was a bespoke unit specifically for planning D-Day. That's Cossack. Eventually, but no, it was run by a man called General Morgan, but he knew he was not going to be the leader at D-Day. At D-Day, they wanted experienced commanders who'd basically won battles and had amphibious operations. And so they chose people from the Mediterranean theater, which had fought in North Africa and then invaded Sicily and then Italy. And so they chose Montgomery, basically, to head the 21st Army Group and commanders from that region. And with Eisenhower in command, because basically he was American, they knew that most of the troops would eventually be American, and he was such a good diplomat. So initially, Austin is under GHQ Home Forces, then it shifts to Cossack, and then Cossack becomes SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters for the Allied Expeditionary Force, with Montgomery in charge. So there's actually three separate, and they're always having problems about what to do with Austin. Where should we put his group? It never quite fits in. Eventually, he's put under SHAEF, but very late, only a month or two before D-Day. And then it becomes a problem. What do we do with him after D-Day? And they decided he needs to become Eisenhower's Order of Battle Chief. So basically the whole TIS, Theatre Intelligence Section unit of SHAEF, becomes Eisenhower's Order of Battle section, and that then goes through Arnhem, the Ardennes, and the final attack into Germany. So yes, he was under a number of different organizations, but I don't think it made a huge difference to him. I think he carried on. See, people actually talk about Austin's little empire. He was an empire builder. And people use the same expression of him after the war. Austin's got this little empire. And he actually says, I want to spread the empire of Oxford philosophy. So he liked this, he wanted to be in sole charge. He was social, but he had to run it. And that was his attitude in the army. And that's where he realized he was good at that. That was the kind of structure he liked. And that's another knock-on effect into philosophy after the war. That's an interesting question. Thank you.
The questions online. In writing about Austin, did anything about him surprise you?
Yes. I'm wondering how much I ought to say about this, because let's say that the family and I had some disagreement about what should go into the final copy of the book, and they won. So that surprised me. Anything else? I think apart from that, his sense of humor, he was, I suppose, how different a man he was in different contexts. That with members of his family, with intimate friends, he was obviously delightful, he was winning, he was funny, he was helpful, he'd go out of his way to assist you. He was a kind of model. That changed if pupils and so forth were dealing with him in public. Between private and public, he became a very different man. Isaiah Berlin said, we'd have these very friendly chats in my rooms, and then we'd started doing this class. And as soon as Austin spoke, I realized this was going to be a war to the death, specifically my death. There was going to be no quarter here at all. So public-private, there's a very marked distinction. And also, in any context with anybody on an equal or superior position. So he was very awkward and prickly with people of equivalent or superior rank. I mean, one of the stories I tell in the book is Austin was a major and came to report what had been discovered on a beach raid to Arromanches a month or two before D-Day. And this was at Bletchley Park. He'd gone over to Bletchley Park especially. And more or less the entire general staff with Eisenhower and all the leaders of the specific armies were there, I assume with Montgomery and various other people. All the senior British officers and American officers were all lined up. And they began to ask him questions. And one American officer said, "Are you quite sure you've got the slope of the beach at Arromanches correct?" And there's a report by Alan Price Jones saying Austin was this fierce little figure with a sort of regulation shirt and these small glinty gold specks. And in response to this question, he said, "You senior officers are all the same. It's not that you try to run before you can walk. It's you try to walk before you can stand up." And, you know, this is a major speaking to Eisenhower and the entire, superior. Apparently the American officer, I don't know who it was, Bradley or someone, said, "Oh, I'm sorry. I shouldn't say that." So he could be very prickly. I mean, you can see that as very brave or very rude, depending on how you look at it. And he was a little bit like that after the war. I mean, in philosophical association meetings, he could be very vicious if he thought, with Popper, there was a famous falling out that he asked Popper a question, and Popper responded apparently with waffle, and so Austin just kept repeating the question until the point where just Popper got his hat and walked out. So I suppose one of the things that surprised me was how very different he was according to context. And it really is, was he a nice man? Was he a nasty man? It can't be answered. You have to say, well, in this context, he was like this. In that context, he was like that. And there wasn't really a simple answer.
And one of the contexts in which the best of him seems to have come out is his time in American academia.
Yes, he absolutely loved America. I mean, it was primarily, I think it was the cult. Well, he always had a close relationship with American graduate students. I think because English public school classicists put him on edge. There was something deep and visceral in it that made him competitive. He found them difficult to cope with and could be difficult. With American graduate students, he didn't find that. Somebody from the Midwest, he just loved it. When he went to America, he was completely bowled over, not so much by the philosophy, but by the society. Because you have to remember, he was born in 1911. So there'd been the First World War in which, his father lost all his friends and his mother lost both her siblings. There was the flu pandemic. There was the Depression. There was the terrible unemployment. There was the Second World War. There was rationing. There was rationing even worse after the war went on in 1954. They were pinched, very difficult times. As I said before, terrible to be born in 1900, only marginally better to be born in 1911. Very difficult times. And suddenly you go from the freezing winters of 1947, shivering rooms in Oxford and, no money and everything drab and grey and bomb sites and terrible old black cars that won't start. And you go to America and he's in Southern California and it's lemon groves and white houses and enormous cars with teeth and wings and chrome and, he goes to something called, he actually writes a letter to Gene, which is largely devoted to something he's come across called a supermarket. And when you go into the supermarket, he said there's fish and there's meat in quantities you would not believe and long playing records. And he's just bowled over by America, particularly Berkeley. He thought Berkeley was just fantastic. He wasn't so struck with the philosophy. He thought it was basically old-fashioned positivist stuff. But when he came back to Oxford, he always wore a blue suit and a tie and not very well pressed. And because in early times, his shoes were in rather bad condition because they kept pigs, and some of his pupils noticed the condition of his shoes. But he always wore the same suit, rather badly pressed. And I think Rom Harry said he was giving a tutorial in Balliol Quad in sort of 1959, or perhaps must be Corpus Quad, I suppose, in 59. And he saw Austin enter the quad dazzling white in a white and pale blue striped seersucker suit, and people just, it basically brought the discussion group to a halt, and everybody took in this sight on the other side of the quad, trying not to appear rude, but just gobsmacked by what had appeared. And his daughter said he took out a subscription to the New Yorker, and he was desperate to go to America, and it was almost entirely his wife's opposition which stopped him. She was a rather nervous disposition and had 5 siblings all in the UK. She couldn't see a life for herself in the States at all. So they said it was, well, it's the children's education, we've got elderly parents and stuff, but it wasn't. It was because she didn't want to go, and he was desperate to go. And clearly there was some tension late in the 50s between them. He thought he could really flourish in America. And as I said, I think his career would have been like Grice. Grice was in Oxford, very famous in Oxford, but published very little. Then he went to the States, and suddenly the States began to change him. I mean, Grice obviously became something of a hippie, which is hard to imagine in Austin. You know, Grice had these, people talk about he held his trousers up, he wore white trousers held up with string, you know, grew his hair very long and loved the hippie thing going on around him. Couldn't imagine Austin that, but then Grice began to publish and lecture very widely and, you know, became a very creative philosopher of language. And I think that's the kind of career Austin was sort of envisioning for himself. I mean, Grice went, I think, in '67. But I think Austin was thinking, you know, I could really flourish in the States. He loved the universities, he loved the graduate students, he liked, you know, he did things like, he always had an open door and people could walk in, whereas in Oxford, he lived in quite a remote house and basically went home to his family. And suddenly he was there to talk with, and the young men found him, you know, and women found him a wonderful interlocutor. So he basically loved America and would have gone there. And it was a very important, and just two other things to say, well, one thing perhaps is, it's interesting that one of the themes in the book is the influence of pragmatism. And the book which completely bowled him over in 1935-36 was a pragmatist book by an American philosopher, C.I. Lewis. And I think you can actually think of How to Do Things with Words as in some ways a pragmatist text. I mean, he said, I actually chose that title for the pragmatist ring. He's giving the William James lectures. And it's clearly talking about language as action. The interest is not in theoretical knowledge, but in practical knowledge. So I actually think that How to Do Things with Words is bringing a kind of refined form of pragmatism back to the Americans. Pragmatism was slightly in abeyance, having had positivism, but there's you know, lots of people had been trained as pragmatists and suddenly recognized How to Do Things with Words as basically, this is kind of influenced by pragmatism. This is interested in practical knowledge, it's interested in value, it's interested in action, you know, all these kind of things. So I think in a way, one of the reasons why he loved America so much was because he's bringing back to America a refined form of American philosophy.
So we've got one more question online, which I'll come to. I've got another question. But I want to take, is anyone else in the room like to take this opportunity?
There's a question over there.
Mark, thank you for a wonderful book and a fantastic presentation. One of the brilliant insights you bring towards the end of the book is about sound symbolism and
Yes.
Austin's interest in sound symbolism. Now, most of us reading Austin get the sense that things are rather petering out with How to Do Things with Words, and he goes to Roy Moore, and things are beginning to hit the buffers. But what your research shows is that it wasn't, and it was beginning to take a new turn. And I just wonder if you could give an account of this interest in sound symbolism, where it might have gone.
Right, well, sound symbolism is the idea, I mean, the official position in most texts in linguistic and philosophy, books on the philosophy of language is that the relationship between a word and what it refers to is entirely conventional. But there is an even older view that basically for a word to work and actually refer, it must have some resemblance to the thing it refers to. And you can find this talked about in Plato's dialogue, the Cratylus, for example. And before the war, Austin said, Cratylus is my favorite philosopher. And he was very interested in Cratylus, the dialogue, because Cratylus, the dialogue, it's talking about sound symbolism. And it has, I can't remember, there's sort of two kinds of distinctions, but there's primary sound symbolism, which is based on things like onomatopoeia, for example. The word sounds like the thing it talks about. And Austin was very interested in this before the war and got very interested in it in the mid-50s onwards and began to sort of collect English words, things like words which end in iggle. I mean, I ought to say that there's a strong version of sound symbolism is this idea it must have some relation to the referent. A weaker version is you'll find that words in a language which talk about the same kind of thing have a similar kind of sound. It's called clustering. So Austin was interested in clustering. He gives the example of iggle endings, for example. Iggle endings generally indicate kind of quick random movement. Jiggle, squiggle, giggle, all those words, there's lots of those. Udge endings are normally, you know, trudge, drudge, fudge, or, you know, depression, slow movement, that kind of stuff. He also talks about it like words which begin GL are often about reflected light. glint, glister, glimmer, glitter. Oh, there's there are hundreds of them in English. I actually did go through the dictionary and have a count. And it's something like, 35% of words beginning GL have to do with light and specifically reflective light. And GLI is very common for bright light things, whereas gloom, gloaming, glum, and so forth, you're heading much towards if you get later into the vowels, they become darker and darker. So Austin was, and SN words are generally nasty. Snide, snotty, sneer, snicker, hundreds of them, And that if you're reading a book like Faulkner, has a language, has a family called the Snopes. Well, somebody called Snopes can't be the hero. Snopes is a hopeless name. Think of another one. So it has this powerful unconscious effect. And Austin was very interested in this. And Chomsky, he talked with Chomsky about this in 1955 because there were some Harvard linguists interested too. And Chomsky said to me he thinks it was complete rubbish. And he just said, and I said, oh, I was thinking writing about it. He said, well, I hope you don't, because I hope the whole thing dies a death, because I think it's nonsense. But Austin was very interested in this for a number of reasons. It begins to break down the distinction between grammar and vocabulary, for example, because you actually can see how words are constructed. For example, app endings tend to refer to flat things. Map, flap, cap. They tend to be flat things. STR tend to be things to do with straightness, stripe, straight. If you put this together, so if you've got sort of a straight thing that's flat, then strap seems a very appropriate way to describe that word, which has both elements of the sound symbolism in it. And Austin was fascinated by breaking down the morpheme, phoneme distinction, all that kind of stuff. And it has implications for poetry as well. That you're often told when you begin literary criticism, you need to look for the way the words enact the sense, or sometimes, in certain cases, the way the words can undercut the sense, and perhaps suggesting there's some kind of tension here. So Austin began to work on that. He had the stuff on how to do things with words, which he didn't write up because he said he thought they were still half-baked. But he had this other stuff he was working on and began to do it very seriously. I mean, they began to read the Sanskrit dictionary, and they wanted to do it because Sanskrit, very, very ancient, pure languages, have more of this. And Malayan, I believe, which I, purely secondhand, I'm just passing this on. But apparently, languages like Malayan are full of it, and they clearly they could tackle Sanskrit more easily. And they began to read the Sanskrit dictionary, go through making examples. So that would have been a second research program. And I think this is important because Austin, I think in about mid-1955, stops being an Oxford linguistic philosopher, applying a linguistic technique to all areas of philosophy, and starts becoming a kind of international philosopher of language, where he's fed up with Oxford. He's interested in America, he's interested in Scandinavia, where he went on his last tour, producing theories with jargon by himself, all the things which he said philosophers shouldn't do for the last 15 years. And it shows a new direction. So he's become an international philosopher of language, not an Oxford linguistic philosopher. He's got this project on how to do things with words, and he's got this stuff on sound symbolism. And I'm sure had he gone to the States, he would have gone and worked on linguistics and the philosophy of language. I mean, the sound symbolism stuff doesn't have a lot of philosophical heft to it, basically. It's hard to see what philosophical problems could be solved by sound symbolism, but it's deeply interested in, if you're a linguist and you're interested in natural languages, then that's a very interesting thing to research. So it's quite possible he would have gone off to the States and become a kind of, perhaps even a descriptive linguist. That's the way his interests were tending.
Mark, just in the 2-minute version, if you can, or even 90-second, last question. If you were able to interview Austin, what would you ask him?
Oh, gosh. That's actually quite a hard question. What would I ask him? I think I'm not sure I've got an answer to that. The written record is quite precise. I mean, the things I'm slightly puzzled about is when I wrote about World War II intelligence, yes, perhaps I would ask Austin this. One of the things I found most difficult was, I began with just a number of random details. And from those random details, I had to build up an account of bureaucratic structures. And this was very difficult to do because they were set up initially, and then they began to change. And sometimes it's just a change of name, and sometimes it's a change of substance. And very often they started poaching on one another's territory, you know, and would actually take over things by, you know, there were lots of power plays going on between intelligence groups. And there were a number of things in there that I might want to ask him, you know, who was your commanding officer at this point? Or were you talking to so-and-so? Or did you realize you were actually encroaching on somebody else's territory? So it's largely that secret intelligence stuff in the Second World War where I realized, I mean, my account is a reconstruction. It's not something, you know, it's dictated, it's not transcribed. I have a scatter of information and I have to make the best conjectures I could. And I think I would quite like to confirm one or two things about bureaucratic structures in that. I mean, perhaps the last thing I could say is I suddenly began to realize in writing the book I was doing something similar to Austin, because Austin was trying to work out what was going on the French coast. And he had, you know, a cat badge, a sighting here, and a larger and unusual order from beer from somewhere else. What do you deduce from that about, you know, German divisions and structures on the French? And I suddenly realized I was trying to do the same thing, I dare say, with much less competence over 70 years. You know, 70 years ago, somebody knew the answer to this. There were all these bureaucratic structures, and I only had these shreds and patches, things people had said in interviews, stuff I discovered on documents that fell out of old library books, trying to work out these structures. So I realized weirdly that writing a historical biography can be quite like intelligence work in that respect. You've got these few bits and pieces, and you have to kind of conjecture what the likely structure that stands behind these few bits and pieces is.
Yeah. So I think this book is going to lead to a renewed lease of life and of renewed impact for Austin's work in ongoing conversation. The White's Chair of Moral Philosophy has itself had a renewed lease of life. It's now the Sakira and White's Chair. It's a real pleasure to have Ludek Sakira with us as well. It's a way of kind of marking marking the significance of Austin's contribution as the White's post holder. And just for those of you who haven't read it, can I really commend it? It's a really, I mean, I wanted to lay this event on because I just think it's a really great book. And hopefully you got a sense this evening that Austin's life and times are bubbling in Mark's brain, and the place to go and capture it is in here, and it's an unusually gripping read. And I hope you can just join me in saying thank you very much to Mark for the public good and for coming.